My name is Egbert Reed. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the quiet one in the room. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in risk compliance for a mid-sized financial firm, the kind of job that doesn't make for exciting dinner conversation. I write contracts, analyze inconsistencies, and notice what doesn't quite align. People assume that makes me dull, predictable, safe. In my family, I've always been the steady son, the dependable one, the one who shows up early to hospital visits and leaves last, the one who pays the bills on time and never makes a scene. My younger sister, Claire, has always been the opposite: charismatic, expressive, emotional. People gravitate toward her. They describe her as strong, decisive, protective. I've never minded being underestimated. There's a certain peace in not being watched too closely. But this story isn't about rivalry, and it's not about revenge. It's about something that happened while our mother was in the hospital, something small enough to pass unnoticed, but heavy enough to change how I see trust forever. When Mom was admitted after a sudden stroke, everything became urgent and fragile. The house felt suspended in time. Decisions had to be made quickly. Paperwork piled up. Emotions ran high. Somewhere in those quiet weeks, between doctor updates and pharmacy receipts, something disappeared. Mom's jewelry. Not the flashy pieces, not the ones insured and documented, the small, sentimental ones. Her wedding band, the thin gold bracelet her grandmother passed down, the sapphire pendant she wore every Sunday for 20 years. Claire handled most of Mom's belongings during that time. No one questioned it. Why would we? She didn't expect anyone to check, and for a while I didn't. What happened next wasn't explosive. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations in hospital hallways. There was just a receipt and what I chose to do after I found it. This isn't a story about catching someone in the act. It's about what silence can build, about the difference between reacting and deciding. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate it. I'll tell you exactly how it unfolded, because sometimes the most powerful shift in a family doesn't come from anger. It comes from documentation. Have you ever realized too late that the person you trusted most never imagined you would look twice? If you asked my extended family to describe me in one word, they'd probably say reliable. Not intelligent, not strong, not even kind, just reliable. The one who answers calls on the first ring. The one who brings extra chairs to Thanksgiving. The one who knows where the spare house key is kept and which drawer holds the insurance papers. I wasn't the dramatic one. I wasn't the loud one. I certainly wasn't the favorite. That was Claire. Claire had a way of filling space. When she walked into a room, conversations tilted toward her. She told stories with her hands. She cried openly. She laughed loudly. When Mom introduced us to neighbors, Claire was my passionate daughter. I was my thoughtful son. Thoughtful, the polite word for quiet. Growing up, it didn't bother me much. I found comfort in being steady. Predictable meant safe. Safe meant no one expected anything extraordinary from me, which also meant no one blamed me when something went wrong. But over time, I began to notice a pattern. When something needed to be done, I was called. When something needed to be decided, Claire was consulted. If the roof needed repair, I handled the contractor. If Mom felt lonely, Claire would arrive with flowers and take pictures for social media. She would caption them, "Family is everything," and everyone would comment on how lucky Mom was to have such a devoted daughter. I didn't correct them. I didn't compete. I paid the bills quietly. I drove mom to routine appointments when Claire was overwhelmed. I learned which pharmacy technician processed her prescriptions fastest. I knew her blood pressure numbers without checking the chart. But in family narratives, those details disappear. What remains are visible gestures. When mom had her stroke, Claire cried in the hospital lobby. People hugged her. Nurses brought tissues. I was the one speaking to the neurologist. I remember standing by the vending machines at 2:13 a.m., holding a paper cup of burnt coffee, listening to Claire tell an aunt over the phone, "I don't know what we'd do without me keeping everything together." I don't think she meant harm when she said it. I think she believed it, and maybe that's what stung. Invisibility isn't dramatic. It's gradual. It's not being interrupted. It's not being asked. It's being the default solution instead of the chosen presence. At some point, I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I started treating it like gravity, something constant and not worth resisting. I kept my leather notebook in my coat pocket, even back then, not because I mistrusted anyone. It was just a habit. Dates, conversations, payment confirmations, medication adjustments. Order makes me feel grounded. Claire used to tease me about it. "You're like a walking spreadsheet." "Egg," she'd say, half amused, half dismissive. I'd smile, because correcting her would have required explaining something she never seemed interested in understanding, that paying attention isn't a personality flaw. It's a form of care. When mom was transferred from intensive care to a monitored ward, Claire volunteered to handle things at the house. She said someone needed to sort through paperwork, clean up, and gather essentials. Everyone nodded. It sounded reasonable. I didn't question it, because I was the reliable one, and reliable people don't create suspicion. They assume alignment. Looking back, I realized something subtle. No one ever asked what I thought. They assumed I would support whatever Claire decided, that my role was execution, not evaluation. I had been assigned that role years ago, quietly, and I had accepted it. At least, I thought I had, until the first small detail didn't add up. The first thing missing wasn't the wedding band. It was the wooden jewelry box. Mom kept it on her dresser for as long as I can remember. Dark walnut, slight scratch across the lid, from when Claire dropped it in high school. Inside, everything had its place. Rings on velvet rolls, bracelets coiled carefully, small, handwritten notes tucked beneath pieces that meant something. When I stopped by the house 3 days after mom was moved out of ICU, the dresser looked cleaner, too clean. I stood in her bedroom doorway for a moment, adjusting to the stillness. Claire had already been there earlier that morning. She'd texted, "Organized some stuff. Don't worry about it." I walked toward the dresser. The lace doily was there. The framed photo of mom and dad from 1989 was still angled slightly left, but the box was gone. I didn't react immediately. People move things when they're cleaning. That's normal, especially during a crisis. Still, I opened the top drawer. Nothing. I checked the closet shelf. Not there. I even looked under the bed, though I knew mom never stored valuables that way. Claire arrived just as I was stepping back into the hallway. "Oh, good. You're here," she said, brushing past me with a canvas tote over her shoulder. "Where's mom's jewelry box?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She didn't hesitate. "I put it somewhere safe." "Where?" "With me." I didn't want it sitting out. Her tone carried a faint edge. Not defensive, but decisive, as if the decision had already been validated in her mind. "Okay," I said, and that was it. No argument, no accusation, but something settled in my chest. Not anger, not even suspicion, just awareness. Later that evening at the hospital, I mentioned it casually. "You took mom's jewelry home. I asked while we stood by the window in her room. Claire sighed. Egg, please don't start. I'm protecting it. You know how people can be. What people? She gave me a look, the kind reserved for someone being unnecessarily difficult. Delivery guys, neighbors, I don't know. I'm just being proactive. Proactive. It was a reasonable word. Mom was still semi-conscious, drifting in and out. This wasn't the time for conflict. I nodded, but I wrote the date down that night, March 17th. Claire moved the jewelry box to her place. Stated reason, security. Not because I distrusted her, because details matter. The next small cut came 4 days later. Mom was more alert by then. Speech is slow, but clear enough. I was helping adjust her blanket when she murmured, Did Claire bring my ring? Which ring? I asked. Your father's, she whispered. Her wedding band. I paused. She has the jewelry box. Mom frowned slightly. It was subtle, but there. She knows I always keep that one separate. I didn't respond immediately. Separate? Mom used to wear the wedding band daily, but when her fingers swelled, a few years ago, she began keeping them in a small porcelain dish inside her nightstand drawer. Not in the wooden box. After Claire left the hospital that night, I drove back to the house. The nightstand drawer was empty. No porcelain dish. No ring. That was the moment the shift began, though quietly. Still no confrontation. Still no accusation. Just a small internal adjustment. I stopped assuming. She didn't expect anyone to check, and until that night, I hadn't. When something feels uncomfortable, but not explosive, most people choose the easier explanation. I was no different. I told myself Claire probably forgot about the separate ring. Maybe she swept everything into a pouch in a hurry. Maybe she planned to bring it back once Mom stabilized. Hospitals distort time. Days blur. Decisions get rushed. It was easier to believe that, and Claire gave me just enough reassurance to maintain that version of reality. When I mentioned Mom asking about the wedding band, she waved it off. It's at my place, Edge. I'm not wearing it, if that's what you're implying. I wasn't implying anything. Well, it kinda sounds like you are. That was Claire's gift. She could reposition a question into an accusation without raising her voice. Suddenly, I was the one who seemed suspicious, petty, distrust during a family crisis. So I backed off. That's what I had always done. Because over the years, subtle dismissals had become normalized. If I questioned a financial decision, I was overanalyzing. If I double-checked paperwork, I was being dramatic. If I hesitated before agreeing, I was making things complicated. Claire, meanwhile, was decisive, confident, protective. People admire decisiveness. They don't admire caution until something goes wrong. In the following week, small inconsistencies surfaced, not loud enough to alarm anyone else, but clear enough for me to register. Claire mentioned selling a few old electronics from the house to cover incidental hospital expenses. That's smart, an aunt said approvingly. You're always so resourceful. I didn't contradict her. I simply asked, which electronics? Oh, just some outdated stuff. Don't worry about it. There it was again. Don't worry about it. A phrase that assumes trust, while subtly discouraging verification. I began noticing how often Claire used it. When I offered to help inventory Mom's belongings, I've already handled it. When I suggested documenting valuables for insurance, that's excessive. When I asked about the jewelry again, Egg, please, this isn't the time. Each dismissal was small, polite, reasonable. And because there was no explosion, no obvious wrongdoing, it became easy to rationalize staying quiet. Family harmony is a powerful incentive, especially when you're the one expected to preserve it. I told myself I didn't want to create tension while Mom was recovering. I told myself that confronting Claire without proof, would only fracture things further. I told myself that trust requires flexibility. But beneath those rationalizations was something else. Fear. Not fear of Claire. Fear of being wrong. If I accused her and she was innocent, I would become the paranoid brother who doubted his own sister during their mother's hospitalization. And that label would stick. So I observed instead. I paid attention to her phrasing, the timing of her visits, the way she avoided specifics when conversations drifted toward money. Once, while we were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, she mentioned casually, "It's crazy how much some of Mom's stuff is worth. You'd be surprised." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Just antiques, vintage pieces. People pay a lot for nostalgia." "Have you had anything appraised?" She stirred her coffee without meeting my eyes. "You really need to relax." That was the moment. I recognized the pattern clearly. Not theft, not yet, but erosion of boundaries, of clarity, of mutual accountability. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's disguised as efficiency, as emotional intensity, as doing what needs to be done. And when someone has always been allowed to operate without scrutiny, scrutiny feels like betrayal. I was still quiet, still calm. But something inside me had shifted from assumption to attention, and attention, once sharpened, doesn't dull easily. Every family has roles. Some are spoken, most aren't. Claire was the emotional epicenter, the expressive one, the defender, the public face of devotion. She handled optics. She narrated events in a way that made people feel included. I was infrastructure. The one who filled out forms correctly. The one who stayed on hold with insurance for 42 minutes without sighing. The one who knew the difference between a power of attorney and a medical directive and actually read the fine print. When Mom was admitted, those roles intensified. Claire managed conversations in the waiting room. She updated relatives through group texts with carefully worded summaries. She chose which photos to share. I handled billing departments, pharmacy coordination, the hospital portal, login credentials. No one explicitly assigned these roles. They simply continued. At one point, an aunt pulled me aside and said, "You're such a good support system for your sister." Support system, not a decision maker, not equal. Support. I didn't correct her. But internally, I recognized something important. My silence wasn't neutral. It was structural. It allowed others to define my position without resistance. The more capable I was behind the scenes, the more invisible I became in front of it, and Claire leaned into that. When doctors asked about discharge planning, she answered first, even when I had already spoken to case management earlier that morning. When extended family asked about finances, she'd say, "Eggs handling the boring details." Boring. There's a particular way that word lands. When you've built your identity around precision, it suggests irrelevance, replaceability. One evening while reviewing Mom's online banking activity, something I'd been authorized to access years ago, I noticed a transfer I didn't recognize. It wasn't large enough to trigger an alarm, just under $4,000. Memo line, personal reimbursement. Date, 2 days after Claire had taken the jewelry box. I didn't react emotionally. I zoomed out. Over the next hour, I cross-referenced timestamps with hospital visiting logs. Claire had been absent that afternoon. She'd texted saying she was running errands. I closed the laptop slowly. Still no confrontation, because I understood something clearly now. If I approached her without clarity, she would reframe it. She always did. "You're overthinking. You don't trust me. This is exhausting." Those phrases had become predictable, and predictability is leverage. If you're patient, the role I had been assigned, the quiet, reliable executor, gave me something Claire underestimated. Access. I had passwords she didn't know I still maintained. Historical statements she had never cared to examine. Insurance documentation dating back 15 years. She operated in visibility. I operated in systems. For the first time, I considered that perhaps my role wasn't as powerless as it appeared. But clarity requires restraint. If you reveal suspicion too early, you teach the other person how to hide better. So I did what I've always done. I stayed quiet. Only this time, it wasn't from habit. It was deliberate. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when I saw the transfer. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion. Mom was more alert that day. Her speech was still slow, but her eyes were clearer, focused in a way they hadn't been since the stroke. Claire had left early, saying she needed to handle a few things. I stayed. I was adjusting the blinds when Mom reached for my wrist. "Egg," she said softly. I leaned closer. "Yeah, Mom. Do you still have my old inventory list?" I blinked. "What inventory list?" "The one we made after your father passed." She swallowed carefully. "Jewelry, silverware, documents." It took me a second to remember. After Dad died, Mom had insisted on cataloging certain items, not because she was wealthy, but because she believed in order. She'd grown up in a house where things disappeared during disputes. She didn't want ambiguity when she was gone. "I have a copy," I said. She nodded faintly. "Good." Claire never liked that list. A quiet statement, not accusatory, just factual. "Why?" I asked gently. She said it made her feel like I didn't trust her. Mom closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Trust doesn't mind documentation." That sentence stayed with me. Trust doesn't mind documentation. There was no bitterness in her voice, no suspicion, just a principle. I didn't tell her about the transfer. I didn't mention the missing ring. I simply squeezed her hand and told her to rest. But when I walked out of that hospital room, something inside me had settled. Not anger, alignment. I went home and pulled the old external hard drive from my desk drawer. It still worked. I located the scanned PDF, Mom, which I had created years ago. 37 items listed, descriptions, approximate values, notes about origin. The wedding band was item number 4, plain gold band, inner engraving, TR plus ML 1987. The sapphire pendant was item number 9, gift from Thomas, 20th anniversary. There were small pieces I had forgotten about entirely. A pair of antique pearl studs, a thin emerald ring from her mother. I compared the list to what I had physically seen in the house 2 weeks earlier. Then I compared it to what Claire had verbally acknowledged having. The overlap was incomplete. Still, I didn't call her. Instead, I did something different. I stopped asking open-ended questions. When Claire texted later that evening, "Everything good?" I replied simply, "Yes, I'm reviewing documentation tonight." She responded with a thumbs up emoji. No follow-up. That was telling. Because if someone truly believes everything is aligned, documentation doesn't threaten them. It reassures them. The next morning, I visited a small, quiet jewelry appraisal office downtown, not to accuse anyone, but to understand resale patterns. What documentation is required? What identification is logged? How transactions are recorded? Purely informational. The appraiser, a woman in her 60s, with steady hands and measured speech, explained the process calmly. "Most legitimate buyers require ID and issue receipts," she said, "even for small pieces." Receipts. I thanked her and left. Walking back to my car, I realized the shift wasn't about catching Claire. It was about clarity. Up until that Tuesday, I had been trying to preserve comfort. Now I was preserving the truth. There's a difference. One maintains peace, the other maintains integrity. And once integrity becomes the priority, your next steps change, even if no one else notices yet. Before that Tuesday, my silence had been reflexive. After it, it became a strategy. There's a quiet distinction between avoiding conflict and preparing for it. One is passive, the other is intentional. And once I understood which side I was on, my posture changed, not outwardly, but internally. Claire didn't notice. Why would she? From her perspective, nothing had shifted. I was still the brother who handled logistics and asked too many detailed questions. Still, the one who paused before responding. Still, the one who never raised his voice. But I stopped seeking reassurance from her tone. When she said, "I've got it handled," I no longer tried to decode whether that meant honesty or evasion. I simply documented the statement. When she mentioned selling a couple of small things to offset expenses, I responded, "Please forward any receipts for record keeping." She didn't reply for 6 hours. Then, "You're really making this transactional." I stared at the message for a moment before typing back. It already is. No accusation, no emotion, just accuracy. That was new. Silence can intimidate people who are used to controlling the narrative. Claire tried a different tactic. At the hospital one evening, she pulled me aside. "Egg, are we okay?" It sounded vulnerable, almost sincere. "We are," I said. "You seem distant." "I'm focused." She searched my face, perhaps looking for irritation, frustration, something she could engage with. But I wasn't offering anything combustible. People often mistake composure for weakness because it doesn't signal threat. But composure is difficult to manipulate. Over the next week, I began organizing everything systematically. Bank statements, hospital invoices, text exchanges, timeline of possession transfers. Not in a dramatic binder, just in my notebook and a secure digital folder. Claire, meanwhile, seemed increasingly casual about specifics. She mentioned taking a small sentimental piece to a jeweler for cleaning. Which piece? "Oh, just something minor." I didn't press. Pressing too early teaches someone where to reinforce their story. Instead, I adjusted my interactions. Shorter responses. Fewer emotional cues. No speculative questions. If she offered information, I acknowledged it. If she avoided detail, I recorded the avoidance. There's something unsettling about being met with steady neutrality when you expect either agreement or resistance. Neutrality forces self-exposure. And slowly, Claire began over-explaining. "I mean, it's not like I'm doing anything shady," she said one afternoon without prompting. "I didn't say you were. I just don't want you thinking I'd ever take advantage." I held her gaze, calm. "Then documentation will make that clear." She looked away first. That's when I realized something subtle. She wasn't afraid of confrontation. She was afraid of the audit. Not a legal audit, but a narrative audit. The kind that cross-references statements with timestamps. The kind that doesn't rely on emotion. She had always operated in emotional leverage. Tears, urgency, protectiveness. But emotion leaves fewer paper trails than transactions. And transactions, even small ones, leave evidence. I still hadn't accused her. Still hadn't mentioned the missing ring directly. But silence, when paired with observation, becomes pressure. Not loud pressure, structural pressure. Like water behind a dam, invisible until it isn't. She didn't expect anyone to check, but now I was. Quietly. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. To Claire, and to the rest of the family, I was still the steady son handling paperwork. If anything, I seemed less reactive than before, more agreeable. That was intentional. What they never noticed was how quietly I was repositioning myself. The first step wasn't confrontation, it was authorization. Years ago, Mom had signed both medical and financial power of attorney documents naming me primary and Claire secondary, not because she favored me, but because I lived closer and handled administrative details more consistently. Claire had always treated that paperwork as symbolic, technical, background noise. But in moments of ambiguity, background noise becomes structure. I scheduled a meeting with Mom's attorney. Nothing urgent, just a review. I framed it as ensuring clarity for discharge planning and future care decisions, which was true. During that meeting, I asked neutral questions. What documentation is required if assets are liquidated while a principal is incapacitated? The attorney adjusted his glasses. Depends on the asset and who has authority. Why? General understanding, I replied. He explained carefully. Unauthorized liquidation, even of small personal property, could become problematic if contested, particularly if documentation didn't align with the stated purpose. I thanked him and left. No accusations, no names mentioned, just information. Next, I requested detailed transaction logs from Mom's bank. Not just summaries, but itemized digital records, including merchant descriptors. The $4,000 transfer from earlier now had more metadata attached. Destination, a checking account I recognized. Claire's. Memo still read, personal reimbursement. There was no attached invoice. Again, not explosive, but incomplete. I didn't call her. Instead, I began mapping timelines. March 17th, jewelry box removed. March 19th, bank transfer. March 22nd, Claire was absent from the hospital for 4 hours. March 24th, she mentioned cleaning a piece. Then I did something subtle but important. I visited 3 local jewelry buyers over the course of 2 afternoons. Not to accuse anyone, not to show photos, just to ask about their intake procedures. Do you log seller identification? I asked one shop owner. Always, he said. State law requires it. We hold items for a certain period before resale. Do you issue receipts? Of course. Receipts, documentation, paper trails. One shop had a digital portal where sellers could retrieve transaction confirmations via email. I noted that quietly. Meanwhile, Claire began shifting tone again. You're being very methodical, she said one evening as we stood in Mom's kitchen. It's my job, I replied. This isn't work. No, I said calmly. It's family, which makes accuracy more important. She laughed softly, but there was tension behind it. You really think I'd do something dishonest? I think clarity prevents misunderstanding. That answer unsettled her more than an accusation would have. Because accusations can be deflected, clarity requires alignment. What she never noticed was that I had also contacted the hospital's social worker to discuss long-term asset management planning. It created a documented trail of proactive financial oversight, one that positioned me as consistent and transparent, not defensive, transparent. Then came the smallest, but most telling, oversight. Claire forwarded me a partial screenshot of a supposed appraisal estimate for miscellaneous gold items. It looked informal, cropped at the edges. No store name visible, no receipt number, just a valuation range. Most people would have accepted it. I zoomed in. The timestamp formatting didn't match standard point-of-sale systems used in our state. Subtle, but wrong. Still, I didn't respond critically. I replied, please forward the full receipt for records. 3 hours passed. Then, I'll have to find it. Of course, she didn't expect anyone to check. Not thoroughly. And that was the difference between us. She operated on an assumption. I operated in verification. By the end of that week, I wasn't looking for proof of theft. I was looking for confirmation of truth, whichever direction it pointed, because once documentation aligns, decisions become simple. And once decisions become simple, action becomes quiet, very quiet. The receipt didn't come from Claire. It came from a system she forgot existed. 3 weeks after Mom's stroke, I was finalizing insurance coordination paperwork when I logged into her email account, something she had asked me to manage years ago because she found passwords exhausting. I wasn't searching for jewelry transactions. I was looking for hospital billing confirmations. That's when I saw it. Subject line, transaction confirmation, gold exchange, Portland, dated March 19th, 2 days after Claire took the jewelry box. I didn't open it immediately. There's a specific stillness that comes before confirmation, when possibility collapses into fact. I sat back in the chair and let the moment settle, not out of fear, not out of dread, out of respect for accuracy. Then I clicked. The receipt was clean, professional, itemized. Seller name, Claire Elise Morgan. ID, verified. Oregon driver's license. Items sold, 14-karat gold band. Engraving noted. Sapphire pendant, blue stone, 3.2 grams, setting. Miscellaneous gold bracelet. Total paid, $4,082.17. Payment method, direct deposit. Attached was a holding policy notice stating items would be retained for 10 business days before resale. I didn't feel anger. I felt alignment. The bank transfer I'd seen, labeled personal reimbursement, matched the exact amount. It wasn't ambiguous anymore. It wasn't cleaning. It wasn't appraisal. It wasn't temporary safekeeping. It was liquidation. And she had used Mom's email for the transaction confirmation, likely because it was already saved in an online intake form from years ago when Mom had a bracelet resized. She hadn't expected anyone to check. Not thoroughly. I downloaded the PDF, saved it to my encrypted folder, printed a physical copy, and placed it inside my notebook. Then I did something that might seem surprising. I closed the laptop and made dinner. No dramatic phone call, no immediate confrontation, no text message demanding an explanation, because now I had clarity, and clarity changes pacing. That evening, I visited Mom at the hospital. She was sitting upright, slowly working through speech exercises. "Did Claire bring your ring yet?" she asked. I met her eyes. "No," I said gently, "but I'm handling it." She studied my face, not searching for reassurance, but reading something steadier. "You always do," she said quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, no suspicion of Claire, just a recognition of consistency. That recognition mattered more than anger ever could. Over the next 2 days, I verified everything. I called Gold Exchange, Portland, anonymously, and asked about holding policies. Confirmed the retention window. Confirmed identification requirements. I cross-checked the timestamp against Claire's hospital visit absence. It aligned precisely. There was no gap left for misunderstanding, only choice. Choice is heavier than discovery. Discovery is passive. It happens to you. Choice requires direction. I had several options. Confront her privately and demand repayment. Inform the extended family and fracture everything immediately. Involve legal counsel. Or wait. Waiting wasn't a weakness anymore. It was positioning. Because the receipt had a clause most people overlook. Seller affirms lawful ownership of items transferred. Claire had signed that affirmation digitally, which meant she had declared the jewelry legally hers. Not Mom's, not shared. Hers. That detail mattered more than the money. It reframed the act from emotional misjudgment to formal misrepresentation. And yet, even with that knowledge, I didn't feel rage. I felt something quieter. Finality. The moment you stop debating whether something happened and begin deciding what to do about it. She hadn't expected documentation to connect, but it had. And once paper aligns with truth, silence becomes very powerful. Once you have proof, emotion becomes optional. That's something I've learned professionally. Evidence simplifies reaction. It narrows the field of interpretation. It removes the temptation to argue over memory or intention. But proof doesn't tell you what kind of person you want to be. That part is still yours. I sat with the receipt for 2 days before making any move. Not because I doubted it, because I wanted to make sure my response aligned with my principles, not my disappointment. There were 4 clear paths in front of me. The first was an immediate confrontation. I could have driven to Claire's apartment, placed the printed receipt on her kitchen table, and asked one question. Why? It would have been direct, efficient, emotionally explosive, and she would have reacted exactly as expected. Tears first, then justification, then a pivot toward how difficult everything had been for her. The second option was family exposure. Forward the receipt to our aunts, our cousins. Let the weight of collective disapproval land quickly. But public humiliation rarely produces accountability. It produces defensiveness. The third was legal escalation. Technically, she had sold property that was not hers, while the owner was incapacitated. The signed affirmation on the receipt complicated things for her. But I knew what that route would cost. Not money, family permanence. The fourth option required the most restraint. Wait until mom regains enough cognitive clarity to review documentation herself. Not to burden her, but to preserve her agency. That was the difference. This wasn't about catching Claire. It was about ensuring mom retained ownership of her narrative. I chose the fourth option, irreversible, because once mom saw the receipt, there would be no version of events Claire could reshape. And once documentation was entered official family record, it wouldn't disappear quietly. So I prepared. I met again with mom's attorney, this time with more specific questions. If assets were transferred under false affirmation, I asked, hypothetically, what remedies exist? He outlined them calmly: civil recovery, mediation, structured repayment agreements, protective financial oversight. Nothing dramatic. Structured. That word resonated. Next, I drafted a simple summary document. Not accusatory, just factual. Timeline, transaction, bank deposit, holding policy. No adjectives, no speculation. Facts don't need emphasis. Then I waited for the hospital's cognitive assessment update. When mom's neurologist confirmed her executive functioning was returning steadily, still fragile, but present, I scheduled a private afternoon visit. Just her and me, Claire texted that morning. I'll come later tonight. I responded. This afternoon works better. She didn't push. Perhaps she sensed a shift. Perhaps she didn't. Either way, the decision had already been made. Once I handed that receipt to mom, the path forward would no longer belong to me alone. It would belong to the truth. And truth, once introduced calmly, doesn't shout. It simply stands. The afternoon I brought the receipt to the hospital, I didn't feel dramatic. I felt precise. Mom was seated by the window, sunlight landing softly across the blanket, over her knees. The occupational therapist had just left. The room was quiet. No visitors, no monitors beeping urgently. Just the hum of ventilation and distant footsteps in the corridor. I sat down across from her. I need to show you something, I said gently. She watched me reach into my notebook. Her eyes weren't weak anymore. Slower, yes, but focused. I placed the printed receipt on the tray table between us, not flipped over, not presented with commentary, Just placed. She adjusted her glasses and began reading. I didn't interrupt. I didn't narrate. Her eyes moved line by line. Seller name, items sold, total paid, the engraving detail. Her fingers trembled slightly when she reached that line. TR plus ML 1987. She didn't cry. That's what struck me most. She didn't cry. She exhaled slowly. The kind of breath that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation of something half suspected. Did she tell you? She asked quietly. No. And the money? Transferred to her account the same day. Another quiet exhale. Mom leaned back against the pillow and closed her eyes for a moment. Not overwhelmed, thinking. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. Call Mr. Hargrove, her attorney. I already spoke to him, I said. We can structure whatever you prefer. She nodded faintly. Not anger, she said after a pause. Structure. That word again. Structure doesn't humiliate. It doesn't escalate. It clarifies boundaries. Within 48 hours, we had taken 3 quiet steps. First, Mom signed a temporary asset protection directive, transferring oversight of all personal property transactions to formal review while she recovered. Second, a formal demand letter was drafted, not accusing Claire of theft, but requesting documentation supporting lawful ownership of the items sold. Third, Gold Exchange Portland was notified that the items were under ownership dispute within the holding window. They responded professionally. Items placed on hold, pending clarification. No drama, no police, just an administrative pause. Claire still didn't know. She texted that evening. How's Mom? Stable, I replied. It wasn't deception. It was sequencing. The next morning, Claire received the attorney's letter via certified mail. I wasn't present when she opened it, but I imagined the silence in her apartment mirrored the one I felt when I first opened the email. Paper has weight when it carries formal language, especially when it contains phrases like, affirmation of ownership requires supporting documentation, and failure to provide substantiation may result in civil remedy. That afternoon, my phone rang. Claire's name on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. What is this? She demanded. Not shouting, but tight. It's documentation, I said calmly. You went behind my back? I followed the procedure. It was just temporary. I was going to replace it. With what? I asked gently. The engraving? Silence, breathing on the other end. You're making this legal, she said finally. No, I replied. Mom is. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. She expected confrontation. She expected emotional leverage. She didn't expect the process, and the process doesn't argue. It moves. Consequences rarely arrive with noise. They arrive with paperwork. Claire didn't show up at the hospital for 2 days after receiving the letter. She texted vague updates. Busy, handling something. We'll talk soon. The tone was strained but controlled, as if she were trying to decide which version of the story to present. Meanwhile, Gold Exchange, Portland, confirmed in writing that the items had been flagged under dispute within the mandatory holding window. They could not legally resell them until ownership was clarified. The receipt that once felt like quiet leverage now had weight in the real world, and weight changes posture. On the 3rd day, Claire arrived unannounced at Mom's hospital room while I was there. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. There's a difference. Mom was sitting upright again, speech, exercises improving daily. The attorney had already reviewed everything with her in a brief private visit. She knew the facts. She knew the amounts. She knew the affirmation Claire had signed. Claire stood at the foot of the bed. Mom, I can explain. Mom's gaze didn't waver. I'm listening, she said calmly. There was no raised voice, no trembling outrage. Claire glanced at me, perhaps expecting an interruption. I didn't speak. She inhaled. I was overwhelmed. The hospital bills were stacking up. I thought I could sell a couple of things temporarily and replace them later. I didn't want to stress you. Mom's tone remained steady. You sold my wedding band. Claire's eyes flickered. I was going to buy a new one. That engraving, Mom said quietly, was carved by hand the year your father worked 2 jobs. Silence. Claire's explanation began to thin. The issue wasn't just the sale, it was the affirmation of ownership. Mom folded her hands. Why did you sign that they were yours? Claire hesitated, and hesitation, in moments like that, is louder than denial. I didn't think it mattered, she said finally. There it was. She didn't think anyone would check. She didn't think documentation would connect. She didn't think the process would activate. Mom turned to me. What are the options? I answered plainly. The items are on hold. She can reverse the transaction within the holding window if repayment is made. Otherwise, we proceed with formal recovery. Claire's head snapped toward me. You're really doing this? I met her eyes, calm. I'm not doing anything. We're clarifying ownership. That phrasing mattered, because this wasn't revenge. It was restoration. Consequences began to ripple quietly after that conversation. The extended family became aware, not through gossip, but through necessity. Claire needed funds to reverse the sale. She asked an aunt for a short-term loan. Questions followed. Not accusations. Questions. Why? What happened? Wasn't Edge handling finances? Narratives began to adjust. Not explosively. Gradually. Claire repaid the jeweler within the holding period. The items were returned, documented, sealed, verified. But something else had shifted. Trust, once fractured by documentation, doesn't reassemble easily. The money was recoverable. The affirmation wasn't. Because signing your name to something untrue isn't a mistake of stress. It's a decision, and decisions echo longer than transactions. The jewelry came back in a small sealed envelope. Gold Exchange Portland required ID verification again, plus written acknowledgement that the prior affirmation had been inaccurate. It wasn't framed as criminal, just corrective. Structured. Claire transferred the repayment amount within the holding window. An aunt quietly loaned her the funds. No one announced it publicly. No dramatic family meeting was called, but silence spreads information efficiently. By the time the envelope reached Mom's hands, 3 relatives already knew something had happened. No details, just enough. Mom opened it slowly at her kitchen table the week she was discharged. The house felt different, not tense, but rearranged. She lifted the wedding band first, turned it over, ran her thumb along the engraving, TR plus ML 1987. Then she placed it back in the porcelain dish in her nightstand drawer, not the jewelry box. That detail wasn't accidental. Claire stood nearby, watching. I said I was sorry, she murmured. Mom nodded once. You did. I paid it back. Yes. There was no shouting, no tears. And that, I think, unsettled Claire more than anything else. Because repayment closes a transaction. It doesn't restore perception. Over the next few weeks, practical consequences unfolded. Mom revised her estate documents. Not vindictively, precisely. All personal property transactions are now required dual authorization, hers and mine, until further notice. Inventory documentation was updated and notarized. Photographs were taken of each listed item. Claire was informed of the changes during a brief meeting with the attorney. She tried to argue. This makes me look untrustworthy. The attorney replied calmly, documentation protects everyone. That phrase landed the way it was meant to. Protects everyone. Claire's access to financial accounts was formally removed, not as punishment, as protocol. When relatives asked gentle questions, Mom answered simply, there was a misunderstanding about ownership. It's resolved. She never used the word theft. She never dramatized it. But she didn't shield it either. And that balance is difficult to confront because once a narrative shifts from devoted daughter under stress to signed affirmation of ownership, it doesn't fully reverse. Claire attempted to recalibrate her image. More hospital visits, more visible caretaking gestures, social media posts about resilience and family unity. But something had changed in the room when she entered. People listened differently, not suspiciously, carefully. That's the quiet cost of misjudging documentation. One evening, Claire came by my apartment. No anger this time, just fatigue. You didn't have to involve Mom, she said. I looked at her steadily. It was her ring. I was protecting her by signing that it was yours. Silence. She sat down across from me. I thought you'd just confront me, she said softly. I didn't think you'd build a case. It wasn't a case. It was a record. And once a record exists, you can't negotiate memory anymore. You can only respond to facts. It didn't have to go this far, she added. It went exactly as far as the paperwork required, I replied. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Not exposure, not rage, process. And the process doesn't yell. It closes doors quietly, sometimes permanently. The final conversation didn't happen in a hospital. It happened at Mom's dining table on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No audience, no raised voices, just 3 chairs and sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Mom had asked for it, not to punish, to settle. Claire arrived first. She looked composed, carefully so. A neutral sweater, minimal makeup, no visible agitation. She had prepared herself for defense. I arrived 5 minutes later with my notebook. Though I didn't open it, Mom began. I don't want tension in this house, she said calmly. But I also don't want confusion. Claire nodded quickly. There isn't any confusion anymore. I fixed it. Mom's eyes were steady. You corrected the transaction. A small distinction. Claire's jaw tightened slightly. I was under pressure, she said. I panicked. I didn't think it would matter if I replaced it. It mattered, Mom replied softly, not accusatory, just factual. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't volatile. It was evaluative. Claire turned to me. You could have just talked to me. I did, I said. When? When I asked for receipts. She looked away. That moment wasn't about victory. It was about acknowledgement. I didn't think you'd actually follow through, she admitted quietly. There it was. The assumption. She had believed my quietness meant reluctance, that my calm tone meant I wouldn't escalate beyond conversation. I don't escalate, I said evenly. I document. Mom glanced between us. This isn't about money, she said. It's about ownership. Claire swallowed. I know. Mom leaned back in her chair. Your father carved that engraving himself, she continued. Not because it was expensive, because it meant something. Claire's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. For once, emotion didn't take control of the room. I didn't think you'd notice, she whispered. Mom's response was gentle. I always notice. That sentence landed heavier than any accusation could have. Claire turned to me again. I didn't expect you to check. I met her gaze calmly. I didn't expect you to sign. Silence. Not hostile. Definitive. There was no explosion, no dramatic reconciliation. Mom outlined the new boundaries clearly. Inventory reviews would continue quarterly. Financial oversight remained structured. Major decisions required transparency, not as punishment, as protection. Claire nodded slowly, not in agreement, in acceptance. That afternoon didn't end with hugs. It ended with clarity. And clarity, when spoken without heat, leaves very little room for reinterpretation. People assume moments like this redefine you through conflict. They don't. They refine you through alignment. Before all of this, I believed being steady meant absorbing discomfort quietly. That preserving harmony required minimizing friction. even when something felt misaligned. Now I understand something different. Harmony without accountability is fragile. It only lasts as long as no one checks. I'm still the reliable one. I still answer calls on the first ring. I still organize documents. I still keep my black leather notebook within reach. But I no longer confuse invisibility with peace. In the weeks after the confrontation, relatives began speaking to me differently. Subtle shifts, questions about planning instead of assumptions about support, invitations to weigh in before decisions were announced. Not dramatic respect, just calibrated acknowledgement. Claire's tone changed, too. Less dismissive, more measured. She doesn't tease me about being a walking spreadsheet anymore. She asks before moving things in mom's house. She forwards receipts. Trust hasn't fully returned. But boundaries have, and boundaries are more durable. Mom recovered steadily, not perfectly, but enough to resume routines. She wears her wedding band again, not every day, but often enough that I notice. Once, while making tea in her kitchen, she said, "You didn't embarrass her." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. "I didn't need to," I replied. That's the part I'm most at peace with. I didn't humiliate my sister. I didn't expose her publicly. I didn't escalate beyond what the documentation required. I let the process speak, and the process is impartial. For a long time, I thought strength meant being louder. Now I know it often means being steadier. Claire once told me she didn't think I'd follow through. She had mistaken quiet for passivity. That's a common miscalculation. I don't need to dominate a room to influence its direction. I just need to understand its structure. There's something freeing about no longer performing a role you didn't consciously choose. I'm not infrastructure anymore. I'm not background support. I'm not the quiet one who won't check. I'm the one who will, calmly, without spectacle, and without apology. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Documentation doesn't destroy trust. It reveals its condition. For years, I believed that love within a family meant flexibility, overlooking small inconsistencies, choosing comfort over scrutiny, assuming good intentions without verification. But love without structure can quietly erode, not because people are villains, because pressure exposes what was never anchored. Claire didn't wake up one morning intending to become the sister who sold mom's wedding band. She made a series of assumptions that no one would check, that she could replace sentiment with currency, that stress excused signature, that my silence meant inertia. She underestimated one thing: consistency. Not anger, not revenge, not public exposure. Consistency. When you consistently document, consistently verify, consistently respond without heat, you remove drama from the equation. And when drama is removed, truth has nowhere to hide. I didn't win anything. I didn't gain power. I gained clarity, and clarity is quieter than victory. The jewelry is back where it belongs. The estate is structured. Boundaries are formalized. Our family dinners continue, not untouched, but steadier. Trust, I've learned, isn't proven by how loudly someone defends themselves. It's proven by how comfortable they are with transparency. If someone reacts strongly to documentation, it's rarely the documentation they're upset about. It's the exposure of misalignment. You don't need to shout to shift a dynamic. You don't need to humiliate to correct a boundary. You don't even need to accuse. Sometimes, all you need to do is check. And when you do, be prepared to follow through calmly. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever stayed silent, assuming peace was safer, only to realize later that quiet verification would have protected everyone sooner? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ